It is Sunday, January 1st, 2023, and apparently the Rose Parade isn't until tomorrow so that the parade doesn't disturb the horses that everybody rides to church. So instead of watching the Rose Parade, which was my plan for this morning, I'm here to talk about my favorite books of 2022. 2022 was a big reading year for me. I decided to commit myself mostly to reading books from independent publishers and university presses, and I started this YouTube channel to document that journey and to share more of these books and publishers and writers that I have personally loved and hopefully match some readers with some really great books. I read a ton of great books this year, so I've just picked the very tippity top of my favorites list to share. Among my favorite novels this year, the one with the best atmosphere would have to be Creatures of Passage. If you like eerie, paranormal, magical tales rooted in a lot of real world issues, but also told with a lot of heart, then maybe check out Creatures of Passage by Maroya Yejide. This is published by Akashic Books in 2021. This takes place in 1977 Washington, D.C., and we're following one particular family, and each member of the family has a kind of a particular paranormal ability. Nephthys Kinwell drives a haunted 1967 Plymouth Belvedere around the city of Washington, D.C., and the car kind of guides her to various down and out people who are in desperate need of a ride somewhere. Nephthys has a niece who can predict the deaths of people in the community, and she has a great nephew who sees ghosts. She has a brother who is a ghost. The atmosphere is otherworldly, and the air is just thick with mystery and history and lore and memory. I loved the language in this book. There's a lot of repetition, a lot of groups of three within the prose, a lot of really rhythmic language and rhythmic structure, and I really loved it. I was completely captivated. The most heart-thumping novel I read this year was Perma Red. If you like heart-pounding, heart-wrenching, propulsive books with characters you desperately root for, but who keep getting knocked down over and over and over again. Again, a book that's rooted in real-world, historically long-standing struggles and issues. And definitely check out Perma Red by Deborah Magpie Erling. This was published by Milkweed Editions in 2022, but it's actually a reissue. It was originally published in 2002. And this is the story of Louise White Elk. She's a teenager living with her grandmother and sister. I believe it's in the 1940s, and they live on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana. And Louise is desperately trying to live life on her own terms. She's a really independent, strong young woman, but her efforts to live her own life are just constantly thwarted by the people and environment around her. She is forced into horrible boarding schools, multiple schools, which she regularly escapes from. She is pursued by three different men who are completely obsessed with her, two of which for sure are very dangerous men. And then she is also just constantly confronted with dangers, both in nature and man-made. Throughout the book, Louise just can't seem to catch a break. It is so brutal, so heartbreaking. And what fascinates me the most in this novel is the kind of constant cycles the book goes through. There's a moment of violence, and then escape, and then return, and then violence, and then escape, and then return, and then violence, and escape, and return. And it's just this constant cycle, and it's really exploring also the power dynamics of the people who live here. No one really has the upper hand for long in this novel, and I flew through this book. It was completely gripping. The imagery was beautiful too. The landscape, the river, the highway, the blood, the horses, the weather, the snow, the rattlesnakes. Oh my God, the rattlesnakes. For me this year, the novel with the best use of point of view was Costa Alegre by Courtney Maum. This was published by Tin House in 2019. This book is structured as the diary of teenage Lara, who's the daughter of heiress and famous art collector Leonora Calloway. Lara and her mother have just helped a group of famous surrealist artists and writers escape Europe on the very brink of World War II, and they find themselves in this kind of isolated, abandoned resort in the jungle of Mexico. There's no strong plot here. It's really Laura's observations of the shenanigans that these artists and her mother get up to in this kind of crumbling old house. They're kind of running out of food, and there's a lot of like dangerous natural elements involved here, and all of the artists are competing for Laura's mother's attention, so Leonora's attention. And then you have 15-year-old Laura, who is trying to find her own voice and her own identity among this group of really famous artists. She desperately wants her mother to approve of her, so she decides she wants to be an artist too, and she wants her mother to think she is just as amazing as the rest of these artists. But Leonora basically ignores Laura, and she doesn't hide the fact that she is pretty disappointed by the fact that Laura is not a child prodigy. And it's heartbreaking. I really love the structure. It's filled with all these lists and sketches that Laura makes in her diary. What I'm not happy about, the heat. What I am happy about, having time with mama. And it's just this really charming elements that you can absolutely imagine a 15-year-old girl writing in her diary. And it's actually loosely inspired by the real life relationship between Peggy Guggenheim and her daughter Pegeen. I think it's Pegeen, maybe Pegeen. There's something about this book with the narrator dealing with a famous mother and trying to find her own voice and her own special place in her mother's life that's really heartbreaking and felt really truthful. The novel with the best use of time that I have read this year is Elena Knows by Claudia Pinheiro, and this was translated from the Spanish by Frances Riddle. And this was published by Charco Press in 2021, and it was actually originally published in Spanish in Argentina in 2007. This is the story of Elena, and she's an elderly woman living with Parkinson's disease who's trying to solve her daughter's death. Elena lives in Buenos Aires, and she's convinced that her daughter Rita was murdered, even though everyone else assumes or has come to the conclusion that Rita committed suicide. When the book opens, Elena has one person left to interview, to talk to about Rita's death. And that person that she needs to talk to lives on the other side of the city. So this book is the story of Elena making her way across the city to interview the one last person she believes has the answers to Rita's death. The novel takes place in one day, revolving around the 3 pills that Elena needs to take in order to just simply move her body. There are frequent, almost constant flashbacks that fill in the rest of the story, and it's magnificently done. And for me, it's the treatment of time that made this book so very special. Throughout the novel, we get the repetition of this phrase, Elena knows, as in Elena knows she needs to take these pills to move her body. Elena knows what chemicals are in the pills that go to her brain and make her brain tell her legs to move. Elena knows that her daughter Rita was frustrated by her caretaking responsibilities. And this concept of knowing is really a function of time. There is a period of time when you don't know something, and then there is the period of time when you do know that something, and you can either come to know something over a long extended period of time, or you can come to know something like in a flash, like a sudden realization. And I really admire the way Pinheiro uses like the structure of the novel and time within the novel to really play with this idea of time and knowing and how they relate to each other. Like when you know something, how long it takes you to get there. That's what really makes this book so special for me. The novel this year that was the weirdest in the best way was My Volcano. In the author's own words, you'll really love this book if you have the opinion that reality is weird. And if you think, like me, that the fact that so many people believe that there's even a steady thing that we could call reality is insane. If that's you, then I think you will love My Volcano by John Elizabeth Stinson. This was published by $2 Radio in 2022. This book is pretty impossible to summarize, but the basic premise is that in the summer of 2016, a volcano emerges in the middle of Central Park in New York City, and the novel follows a whole huge cast of characters who are impacted by this active volcano growing in the middle of over the course of one summer. And the characters are from all over the world, but there's also other things going on, like a nomadic farmer in Mongolia who is stung by a bee and proceeds to turn into a green, thorny, plant-like creature who starts absorbing the consciousness of all living things surrounding him until he becomes one big, massive, single-minded horde engulfing an entire continent. So that's the kind of thing you'll find in this novel. The novel jumps back and forth in time a ton throughout this one summer, and then also like 500 years previous. There's a lot of jumps, and also jumps quickly between each of the characters' different stories. There are also these godlike creatures called the Otherwise, which really grabbed my attention because I really love that word. I love to think about that word for some reason, Otherwise. And I thought it was such a clever name for these creatures who were not human. They're other than human, and they also seem to be orchestrating a lot of what is happening here to the humans. So the Otherwise are really cool. And then there are a lot of really amazing lemonade commercials. It's weird, it's wonderful, I loved it. The novel with the best characters that I read this year was Martha Moody. If you like love stories, if you like stories of women finding their voices and independence, if you like old American West pioneer homesteader vibes, then I think you'll really love Martha Moody by Susan Stinson. This was published by Small Beer Press in 2020, but again, it was originally published in 1995, so another reissue. Martha Moody is the story of a woman named Amanda Linger who lives in a small farming community in the old American West. Amanda is in a not very great marriage, and her best friend is her cow, Miss Alice. She's not living a super exciting or particularly fulfilling life. That is until she falls in love with Martha Moody, who is the proprietor of the town's general store. And while Martha and Amanda start this clandestine affair, Amanda also discovers that she has this passion for writing fiction as well, and so she starts secretly writing stories, and eventually she comes to write these fables or stories about Martha, but it's not the Martha she knows. It's like a larger-than-life Martha who is kind of Paul Bunyan-esque. And this book, I think, really plays with the idea of how legends are formed, about myth-making in the American West, about how we find our creative voices, about what it means to be a community and also what it means to be an outsider in a community. If you asked me tomorrow, and if you had asked me yesterday, I might have said that this was my favorite book of the year, but it probably is my favorite novel of the year. I had two favorite short story collections this year, and the first up is Ghosts by Edith Wharton. If you like creepy but not terrifying ghost stories, if you like early 20th century fiction written by American women, if you like Edith Wharton, then I suggest you read Ghosts by Edith Wharton. This was published by New York Review of Books in 2021. It was another reissue, originally published in 1937. And this is a collection of Edith Wharton's most chilling stories written between 1902 and 1937. I have never read any other Edith Wharton before, but still these were like exactly what I expected from Edith Wharton. From what I know about her work, there are large estates, really big grand houses, lots of issues of inheritance and marriage and aging and class and old wealth and new wealth and social standing, all with like a really dark, ominous ambiance. My favorite story might have been one called Afterward, and it's about this American couple who moved to England, and they decide they want to buy a house that is way out in the country, and as they're searching for their perfect home, they decide that their old home they're moving into must have a ghost, or rumors of a ghost. And so they hear of one home that is for sale, and they ask their cousin if there are any stories of ghosts who have appeared in this one particular house, and their cousin or friend says, well, yes, there have been some stories, but all the stories have kind of a recurring theme that the people who encounter the ghost don't realize that it was a ghost until much afterward, until much later. Of course, they buy the house, and that's where the real story begins. My other favorite story collection this year was Tender by Sophia Samatar. I read a bunch of Sophia Samatar this year. This one was published by Small Beer Press in 2017. I describe these as a mixture of fantasy and science fiction. We have aliens, we have godlike creatures, we have ogres, we have folklore, historical fiction, dystopian fiction, post-apocalyptic fiction. My favorite story was one that was kind of written as a response to The Heart of Darkness, and my other favorite story is about a human colony on a distant planet. We got a lot of variety here. What I loved most about these stories was the creative use of point of view. From what I read, Sophia Samatar's work is always about storytelling itself. Who gets to tell a story, why they get to tell that story, who they are telling it to, how they are telling it, why they are telling it now, what had to happen in order for them to be telling it, how a story changes based on who is telling it, and how a story changes based on who is listening to it. That's the kind of stuff I love to think about when I'm reading fiction. I think this was the third book I've read of hers, and I am continuously blown away about how she writes stories about stories. I was a little worried that by kind of switching mostly over to independent presses that I'd be missing out on some of the fun crime novels that I love to read, but I need not have worried because I read some really great crime this year, including 5 Decembers by James Kestrel. This was published by Hard Case Crime in 2021. This novel opens, I think, on Thanksgiving Day or right around Thanksgiving in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1941. And police detective Joe McGrady is assigned to a really grisly murder case. And in order to investigate the crime, like right around Thanksgiving, in order to investigate this crime, he is sent overseas to Hong Kong. That's where the lead takes him, is to Hong Kong. So he's sent to Hong Kong. So he's in Hong Kong. And if you know anything about history, you know what happened in December 1941, and so he's in Hong Kong when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. And McGrady ends up in prison in Hong Kong, and then he eventually is captured by the Japanese, and he is sent to Japan. And basically he spends the entirety of World War II, so 5 Decembers, away from home, stuck, unable to get back to Hawaii, and trying to solve this murder case. This is just a straight up good read. There are some questionable, stereotypical treatment of the female characters, but I probably should have guessed that based on the cover. But I had a good time. What can I say? Did I guess who the killer was? Yeah. Did I care? No. I also read Generation Loss by Elizabeth Hand. This was published by Small Beer Press in 2020, but was originally published in 2007. This is the story of Cass Neary, a down-and-out photographer who made a name for herself in the 1970s punk rock scene in New York City. She had a brush with fame when she published a series of photographs, I think called Dead Girls, which you can imagine what the subject was. But now she's washed up, she's frequently drunk or high. She really doesn't have any friends. She is broke. She has no career prospects. And she is hired by an acquaintance to go interview and photograph a very famous but reclusive photographer named Aphrodite. And Aphrodite lives on a remote island off the coast of Maine. So Cass takes the job and heads up to Maine, and it's November-ish, I think, and so the weather is not great. So she heads up to Maine, and once she makes it to this remote island, she discovers that maybe she's not quite as expected as she thought she was gonna be by this famous photographer Aphrodite, but also there's been a string of mysterious deaths. The setting and the characters were a big win for me. remote island off the coast of Maine, only accessible by boat, a population of slightly off characters who live on this island, a snowstorm, a really misguided fish out of water narrator, and a killer on the loose. Did I guess who the killer was? Yeah. Did I care? No. I also read Deer Season by Erin Flanagan. This was published by University of Nebraska Press in 2021. It takes place in 1985 in a small farming community in Nebraska. And a teenage girl, Peggy, goes missing right at the opening weekend of the hunting season. And the whole town almost immediately suspects a man named Hal, who has an intellectual disability and a long history of being misunderstood by his neighbors and his family. Hal's friend Alma does her best to defend him through all of these accusations, but there's only so much she can do when everyone else in the town has decided that they're gonna label him as a suspect. And we shuffle among three different perspectives. We have Alma's husband, Kyle, and we have Peggy's little brother, Milo. And this was just a good suspense novel. I love the setting in early winter in a farming community in the rural Midwest. It's pretty slow moving. It has a lot of like really great nostalgic 1980s references, rich characters and relationships, and plenty of small town drama. Did I guess who the killer was? Yeah. Did I care? No. I also love that the University of Nebraska has this flyover fiction series that focuses completely on the Midwest. I'm a huge fan of anything that is particularly dark and set in the Midwest. I read a lot of really great poetry this year, and I always find it really hard to describe poetry collections, so I'll do my best, but I'll also link to some example poems in the description so you can check it out for yourself. So first we have Bluest Nude by Ama Codjoe, and this was published by Milkweed Editions in 2022. Bluest Nude is Ama Codjoe's debut full-length poetry collection, and here's the description from her website. It says, purposefully shifting between the role of artist and subject, seer and seen, Codjoe's poems ask what the act of looking does to a person. Public looking, private looking, and that most intimate, singular spectacle of looking at oneself. So I read the collection, I liked it a lot, and then I listened to an interview with Ama Codjoe on the podcast Between the Covers, hosted by David Naiman, and it blew the collection wide open for me. I understood it in such a deeper way, and I often listen to interviews with poets on podcasts, so this wasn't something new that I was doing, but there was a specific moment in this podcast that made me realize that this should always be part of my poetry reading practice, hearing about the collection straight from the poet's mouth, in addition to reading the poems themselves. And that specific moment that made me realize this was a story that Ama Codjoe shared. At the beginning of the interview, she mentions an art exhibit at Columbia University that in part inspired this whole collection. The exhibit was curated by a woman named Dr. Denise Morel, and the exhibit was called Posing Modernity, the Black Model from Manet to Matisse to Today. And the exhibit starts chronologically with Manet's painting titled Olympia, and specifically focuses on the black model in that painting, who is a real-life woman named and model named Laure. Ama Codjoe visited this exhibit, and the rest of the exhibit really focuses on black models in art and famous paintings from this time of this painting by Manet up until today. And Ama Codjoe visited the exhibit, but she also listened to a talk given by Dr. Morel about the exhibit. She says that one of the reasons the exhibit so enthralled her and so inspired her was not only the exhibit itself, which was powerful and wonderful, but also hearing Dr. Morel talk about her process. And it was a revelatory moment for me because I was doing the same thing. I was listening to the creator, Ama Codjoe, talk about the process of creation and allowing that to deepen my understanding and appreciation of the text. And that's my true love. It's the process and the problem solving and the influences. Why these poems? Why now? And it also helps me understand on a literal level the poems themselves because I'm a novice at poetry reading. But in the interview with David Naiman, Ama Codjoe talks about how when she's alone in a room and looks at herself in a mirror, she's not actually alone. She's never alone, because there are so many countless people who make up who she is. And so I think I'd like to make sure that my reading practice going forward honors that idea that a book is never just a book. It's many different books, many different people, many different events and histories, and that's all part of the process of creation. My two favorite individual poems this year were by Ada Limon, and both were from her new collection, The Hurting Kind. This was published by Milkweed Editions in 2022. I won't read them here, but I will link them below. You can find them both online. And the first one is called Give Me This. The poem features a groundhog that the speaker is noticing in her backyard. And as the speaker's watching this groundhog, she's wondering if she's allowed to have this joyful, delightful moment of watching the groundhog. As a poet, she's being asked constantly to write about suffering and pain and war, but she really just wants to write about this delightful, joyful moment of watching the groundhog eat her tomatoes in her backyard. And I think a lot about this when I think about poetry and poets. Whenever our society or our community is in crisis, we often turn to poets. When we're struggling ourselves to find the right words, we start quoting wise poets who've lived before us, or asking our living poets to give us language that will help us make sense of the moment, language that will help us figure out how to feel. But why do we put that burden on our poets? Is this something poets have asked for? Do we pay attention to them as much when we're not in crisis mode? Could we have avoided some crises if we listened carefully all of the time? Not just when we're scrambling for some kind of response, not just when we non-poets feel ill-equipped to speak. I don't know. But I loved the poem and I loved the groundhog. I also loved the poem, The End of Poetry, and I first encountered this poem by hearing Ada Limon read it on, I believe it was on the poetry podcast Verses, where I first heard her read that poem. And this poem is really like one big long list of common elements you might find in a lot of poetry, like chickadees and mothers and fathers and children and life and death and concepts like suffering and existence. And the speaker in the poem is listing all of these big things that you find in poetry and is saying enough of all of it. And you really have to listen to Ada Limon read it, I think, to feel it the most. And the last line is so amazing. This channel is devoted to small and independent publishers, but that doesn't mean that's all I read. And here to prove it is one of my favorite nonfiction books of the year. It's called Outlaw Ocean: Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier by Ian Urbina. And this was published in 2019 by Knopf. And this is crazy, amazing reporting on the brutal, nearly lawless realm of the open ocean. Each chapter focuses on a specific and different type of illegal activity that happens out on the open ocean. Out on the ocean, international law is murky at best, and no country or governing body is really willing or even really able to actually police the ocean anyway. The stories here range from illegal fishing to slavery to trafficking to murder to illegal dumping of waste to piracy to stowaways. And the journalist Ian Urbina is there in every single chapter. He's on these ships out in the middle of the ocean. He's chasing down the world's most wanted illegal fishing vessel, literally the world's most wanted illegal fishing vessel. He is tracking down. It is fascinating and it is so good. Also making onto this list in the 11th hour, because I just finished it yesterday on December 31st, is The Life and Death of a Minke Whale in the Amazon, Dispatches from the Brazilian Rainforest. And this is by Fabio Zucker, and it's translated from the Portuguese by Ezra E. Fitz, and this was published in 2022 by Milkweed. This is a collection of essays by journalist and anthropologist Fabio Zucker, who has gathered stories and voices from the Brazilian Amazon. Zucker has spent a significant amount of time with people who live in the Amazon, indigenous and non-indigenous communities who live and rely on the land and the rivers and the animals and the plants of the Amazon. And he's really learning here how industry-driven deforestation and other forms of habitat destruction not only forever alter vital ecosystems, but also destroy entire communities' way of life and significantly raise these communities' likelihood to fall into poverty and poor health. And here Zucker really documents the various complex political and cultural struggles of people who Zucker describes aren't struggling just for existence, but for, as he says, a different existence, not to let themselves be absorbed into an all-encompassing white culture. The essay collection was kind of meandering, but I got so much out of this. As you can see, it is so smart and it really made me think. And the best part of this book, first of all, look at this map. And then throughout there are illustrations by an indigenous artist. Let me see if I can find one. An indigenous artist named Gustavo Caboclo. They're so cool. It's so beautiful. I mean, it's truly beautiful. It's probably the most beautiful, like physically beautiful book I've read this year. I mean, got little section breaks with the little fish. Great book. I'm ending on my two favorite books of the year. One is published by a small press, one is not, but both were written by two of my all-time favorite writers. First up is The Letters of Shirley Jackson. These were compiled and edited by her son, Lawrence Jackson Hyman. It was published in 2021 by Random House, and these letters span from her college years up until only a few days before her very early death at the age of 48. And these letters are so special. They start with a young Shirley sending letters to her future husband while they were courting, and they follow Shirley through her travels through motherhood and house hunting and Christmases and getting new dogs and new cars and all of her writing and publishing adventures and the many, many, many parties thrown by Shirley and her husband in their home. She is so, so incredibly funny. That was the best part of these letters, was her sense of humor and her just beautiful sense of telling a good story. And included in here are hilarious little sketches that she drew, mostly of herself and often her husband. Here's one I think of getting a new car. They're just really charming, and she always draws herself with this really crazy hair that I feel like I can identify with. This quickly became one of my absolutely most treasured books. And finally, we have Kingdoms of Elfin by Sylvia Townsend Warner. This was published in 2018 by Handheld Press. Originally published, as you probably are sensing a theme here, originally published in 1977. But these were all stories that appeared throughout the 1970s in various places like the New Yorker. And these are loosely linked short stories, but you could be fooled into thinking that this was actually a nonfiction anthropological ethnographic study of the various communities within the fairy kingdom. And these fairy realms span across all of Europe. Sometimes our elven friends encounter humans, but a lot of the stories are just about life within these fairy kingdoms. It's about, how succession works when the queen fairy dies, or about class differences and court life. Did you know that noble fairies aren't supposed to fly, but that the working class fairies do have to fly a lot of times to be able to do their jobs? There are magical elements like werewolves and invisibility, but these are not warm and fuzzy fairy tales. This isn't your typical fantasy genre fiction. Each story is so very coolly told, very detached narration, absolutely deadpan humor. There's a lot of cruelty, but also a lot of whimsy to be found in these fairy realms. It's cold and it's sharp and it's precise and it's delightful. I don't reread books very often. That's something I wish I did more of. So I don't reread books often, but I will be rereading this one for sure. If you found anything that intrigues you among these books, I hope you'll hit the like button. That will help them spread across the internet a little bit more widely, and hopefully get these books into the hands of people who will love them. Thank you so much. Best wishes for a very happy new year, and I hope you find something great to read. Bye.